The night I finally understood everything. I was standing in my own kitchen holding a casserole dish my wife had made 3 days earlier. It was still in the refrigerator, untouched, covered in plastic wrap with a little yellow sticky note on top that read, "Heat at 350 for 20 minutes. Love you." And I remember thinking how strange it was that a person could write those 3 words so casually, so automatically, like signing a receipt. Like the words meant nothing more than a habit. I set the dish down on the counter. Outside, the October wind was pressing against the kitchen window, and the glass trembled faintly in its frame. The neighborhood was quiet. It was a Friday night. She wasn't home. My name is Daniel. I'm 38 years old. I work as a structural engineer for a mid-sized firm downtown. The kind of job that sounds impressive at dinner parties, but mostly means long hours in front of AutoCAD files and site visits to buildings that all start looking the same after a while. I've been married to Claire for 11 years. We have a daughter, Lily, who is 9, and a son, Owen, who just turned 6. We live in a house with a green front door on Ashwood Lane, in a quiet suburb where people mow their lawns on Saturday mornings and wave to each other from driveways. It was, by most visible measures, a good life. Claire is 36. She's a part-time graphic designer who works from home 3 days a week and picks the kids up from school every afternoon. She makes elaborate weekend breakfasts, the kind with fresh fruit arranged in patterns on top of pancakes. She remembers everyone's birthdays. She volunteers at the school book fair every November. She is, by every external measure, a devoted mother and a thoughtful wife, which is exactly why it took me so long to see it. We had been together since our late 20s, introduced through mutual friends at a rooftop gathering neither of us had particularly wanted to attend. I remember she was wearing a yellow dress and arguing passionately about a film I hadn't seen, and I remember thinking, even before I knew her name, that she was the kind of person who made rooms feel more inhabited, more real. 11 years later, I still believe that. Even as the evidence was slowly, quietly assembling itself around me like furniture being rearranged in a dark room. The girls' night started about 8 months before that October. Or rather, that's when I first noticed them as a pattern. Claire had always been social, always maintained a tight circle of friends from university and from the neighborhood. Mara, Jess, sometimes a woman named Priya who I'd met twice, and always seemed vaguely uncomfortable around me. Friday evenings, occasionally a Saturday. I never thought much of it. We had a life, a rhythm, a shared calendar on the refrigerator with color-coded entries. Her nights out were marked in blue. Blue became a color I came to dread. But the moment I keep returning to, the moment that, in retrospect, was the true beginning of the end, didn't happen on a Friday. It happened on a quiet Tuesday afternoon in early September when I came home from work an hour earlier than usual because a site meeting had been canceled. I pulled into the driveway, cut the engine, and sat for a moment in the sudden silence. The house looked perfectly ordinary. The green door, the window boxes with the last of the summer flowers going brown at the edges. And across the street, slightly down the block, our neighbor Frank Olson was standing at the edge of his driveway, holding a garden hose that wasn't running, watching my house with an expression I couldn't quite read from that distance. When he saw me, he raised a hand, smiled, went back inside. I didn't think about it again for weeks. But I should have. Because Frank Olson had been standing in that driveway a lot lately, I realized later. Always with something in his hands, a hose, a coffee cup, a folded newspaper. Always, somehow, facing our house. And always, when he saw me, that same slightly too careful smile. Frank was 61, a retired civil engineer, which gave us enough common ground for pleasant 10-minute conversations over the fence. His wife, Diane, had passed away 2 years earlier from a brief and brutal illness, and since then he'd lived alone in the beige colonial across the street, tending his roses with a dedication that bordered on devotion. He brought us tomatoes from his garden in the summer. He shoveled our front walk once, unsolicited, after a heavy snowfall. He was, in every sense, the kind of neighbor people mean when they say they don't make them like that anymore. He was also, I would eventually understand, the only person on Ashwood Lane who knew exactly what was happening and had been carrying that knowledge alone for 6 months. That Tuesday in September, I went inside, kissed my daughter on top of her head, helped Owen with a puzzle, and ate dinner with my family. Claire was warm and present and laughed at something Owen said about dinosaurs. She reached across the table and touched my hand once, briefly, the way people do when they're comfortable, or the way people do when they're guilty. I didn't know which it was yet, but somewhere in the back of my mind, something had shifted, quietly, like a floorboard settling, and I don't think it ever fully shifted back. What this opening establishes, psychologically, is not suspicion, it's the slow erosion of certainty. Daniel doesn't begin the story suspicious. He begins it comfortable, embedded in the texture of a life that appears whole. The sticky note with "love you" is a precise detail, affection reduced to reflex, intimacy operating on autopilot. This is the psychological condition that makes betrayal possible to sustain over months, not the absence of love, but its domestication into routine. Daniel's professional identity, structural engineer, a man trained to assess load-bearing capacity, to identify hidden fractures in apparently solid things, functions as quiet, dramatic irony. He is, by training, someone who finds the flaws others miss. Yet in his own home, he sees only what he expects to see. This is the psychological phenomenon known as confirmation bias operating in reverse, not seeking evidence that confirms a fear, but unconsciously filtering out evidence that disrupts a preferred reality. Frank Olson's appearance at the edge of the driveway is the story's first true signal, and Daniel almost registers it. The detail of the unrunning hose is telling. Frank is not doing anything. He is watching. His too careful smile when caught is the behavior of someone managing knowledge they haven't decided what to do with yet. The audience senses this before Daniel does, which creates immediate dramatic tension. We are already ahead of the protagonist, and that gap between what we suspect and what he knows is where all the story's pressure will build. October arrived the way it always did on Ashwood Lane, gradually, then all at once. One morning the maple in the front yard was still mostly green, and the next it was the color of a dying fire. Claire bought a bag of candy corn she claimed was for the kids and ate half of it herself over 3 evenings, watching home renovation shows with her feet tucked under her on the couch. Lily started a new reading project at school. Owen lost his first tooth and left a note for the tooth fairy that said, in his careful 6-year-old printing, "Please leave money, not coins." It was, in its surface texture, a season of ordinary happiness. And yet, the Friday nights had settled into a pattern so smooth, so well-oiled, that I almost didn't notice when they stopped feeling spontaneous. Claire would mention it by Wednesday, always midweek, always casual. "Mara wants to do Friday again, if that's okay?" The phrasing itself was considerate, even solicitous. If that's okay, which meant I never had a clean reason to object. What would I have said? That I didn't like her seeing her friends? That the frequency bothered me? It would have sounded possessive, unreasonable. So I said what I always said. "Of course, go ahead." She'd leave around 7:30, usually dressed nicely but not extravagantly. Jeans, a good blouse, her camel-colored coat. She wore the same perfume she always wore, a warm, slightly smoky scent I'd bought her for her birthday 2 years running because she loved it. She'd kiss me, kiss the kids if they were still up, and then the green door would close and the house would go slightly quiet in that particular way it does when one of its primary inhabitants is absent. She was usually home by midnight, sometimes 11:30, once 1:15, which she explained the next morning as, "We just lost track of time. You know how Mara gets." I nodded. I didn't know how Mara got. Mara was loud and funny and enthusiastic, and I'd always liked her. Except, and this is the thing that snagged in my mind like a loose thread, I hadn't seen Mara in almost 4 months. We'd had them over for a barbecue in late June, Mara and her husband Tom, and it had been a good evening. Tom and I had talked about the playoff season. Mara had helped Claire with the kids. It was easy and warm and normal. But since then, nothing. No mention of Tom. No mention of anything Mara had said or done that wasn't directly related to these Friday evenings out. Claire's stories about their nights were oddly thin. We went to that wine bar on Preston, you know the one. Or just walked around. Ended up at Jess's place for a while. No anecdotes. No gossip. No texture. Claire was a woman who always had texture. She was a natural storyteller, the kind of person who could turn a trip to the grocery store into something entertaining. It was one of the things I had fallen in love with, her ability to make the ordinary feel inhabited. The stories she told me about Friday nights were like photographs with the background blurred out. I noticed this, filed it somewhere vague and internal, and did nothing with it. The first concrete thing I noticed, a real thing, not a feeling, was the mileage. It started accidentally. In late October, I had borrowed Claire's car for 2 days while mine was in the shop, and when I returned it, I noticed the odometer reading out of habit, the way engineers notice numbers. I didn't write it down, but 3 weeks later, when I borrowed it again for a single errand, a 20-minute round trip to the hardware store, I glanced at the odometer again and paused. The number was higher than I expected, not wildly so, but enough that I stood in the driveway for a moment, doing the mental arithmetic. Our lives were geographically small: school drop-off, the grocery store, her parents' house 40 minutes away, the occasional trip downtown. I knew, roughly, what our weekly mileage should look like, and what I was seeing suggested more driving than our calendar accounted for. I told myself there was an obvious explanation I wasn't thinking of. Probably there was. I went inside and didn't mention it. The second thing was a name. Claire was on the phone one evening. I assumed with Mara, based on her body language, that relaxed and slightly performative ease people adopt with old friends. I was moving through the hallway toward the kitchen and caught a fragment. I told him that already, Marcus. She looked up, saw me, and her body did something subtle, a micro-adjustment, a slight straightening, the phone tilting a few degrees away. The sentence ended. She smiled at me with her eyes only. Mara, I said, gesturing at the phone. She shook her head. Jess, wedding drama. I nodded and went into the kitchen and stood at the counter for a long moment, looking at nothing. Marcus. I didn't know a Marcus. Not in Claire's life, not in our shared social landscape. I ran through the catalog of names I associated with her: colleagues, old classmates, the husbands and partners of her friends. No Marcus. It was possible he was a peripheral figure. Jess's fiancé's friend, a co-worker, someone mentioned once in passing months ago that I'd simply forgotten. These things happened. Life was full of names that didn't require explanation. But Claire had said him. I told him that already, with a kind of familiar exasperation. The exasperation of someone managing a relationship, not referencing a stranger. I lay awake for a while that night. Claire fell asleep easily, the way she always did, curled on her left side, facing the window. I watched the pattern of light on the ceiling, the street lamp filtering through the curtains, and ran the fragment of conversation through my mind until it stopped meaning anything. By morning, I'd half convinced myself I'd imagined the look on her face. But 3 days later, Lily said something at dinner that I couldn't explain away. We were eating pasta, Tuesday night, nothing special, and Owen was pushing a piece of broccoli around his plate with focused displeasure, and Lily, without looking up from her own food, said, Mom, are we going to Marcus's house again soon? The room didn't change. The pasta was still steaming. Owen was still sulking over the broccoli. But something happened in the air between Claire and me, a tension so faint it was almost atmospheric. Claire said, very calmly, What do you mean, sweetheart? Lily shrugged with the magnificent indifference of a 9-year-old. The man with the dog. You took us there that one time, remember? The big yard. Oh, Claire said. That was just a friend's house. Someone from work. Can we go back? His dog was really big. We'll see. And that was it. The conversation moved on. Owen finally ate the broccoli under protest. Claire refilled my water glass without being asked, which she did sometimes, a small automatic gesture of consideration. I watched her hands as she poured. Completely steady. The psychological architecture of this section is built on a concept therapists call ambient awareness, the accumulation of small, unresolved signals that the conscious mind dismisses but the nervous system quietly registers. Daniel isn't yet suspicious in any active, investigative sense. He is, instead, experiencing a low-grade cognitive dissonance, the gap between his established image of Claire and the data points that don't quite fit it. The detail of the blurred-out stories is particularly revealing. Intimacy is built on specificity, the shared anecdotes, the particular details that make experiences real and communicable. When Claire's Friday night narratives lose their texture, she is unconsciously or consciously creating emotional distance. She is managing two realities simultaneously, and the management requires simplification. The stories become props rather than genuine communication. Lily's innocent remark at dinner is the story's first genuine structural crack. Children are psychologically transparent in ways adults are not. They have no investment in maintaining the fictions adults construct. Her casual mention of Marcus's house and the big yard detonates quietly in the narrative because it confirms something Daniel has only intuited. The name Marcus belongs to a real, physical place that his wife and children have visited together. This transforms a suspicion about infidelity into something more unsettling, a parallel domestic world, complete with a yard and a dog, that Daniel has been entirely excluded from. Claire's response, steady hands, calm voice, immediate redirection, is the behavior of someone who has rehearsed for exactly this moment, which means she knew it was coming. That preparation is, in its own way, more disturbing than the revelation itself. November came in cold and gray, the kind of cold that settles into old houses and makes the radiators tick and groan all night. I started sleeping poorly. Not dramatically, not lying awake for hours, but waking at 2 or 3 in the morning with a sense of vague alertness, as though some interior alarm system had been quietly activated and was now running in the background of everything. I began paying attention differently, not consciously, or not at first. It was more like a recalibration of my ordinary perception, a subtle sharpening of focus toward details I'd previously let pass without examination. The way Claire angled her phone when she was texting, the slight delay before she answered simple questions, the evenings when she seemed to be somewhere else entirely while sitting directly across from me. I noticed, for instance, that she had started closing the bathroom door when she made calls. She had never done this before. We were the kind of couple who had always been comfortable with the casual invasions of privacy that long cohabitation creates. Doors left ajar. Conversations continued through walls. The closed door was small. It was also, unmistakably, new. I noticed that she had created a new email address. I found this by accident. She'd left her laptop open on the kitchen table, and when I moved it to make room for the groceries I was putting away, the screen brightened and I caught a glimpse of an inbox I didn't recognize. Not her usual address, the one she'd had since college, the one I knew. A new one, something with initials and numbers. She closed the laptop before I could read anything. The movement so swift and practiced that it was clearly not the first time she'd needed to close it quickly. New account for a client project, she said, without looking up. The old one's getting too cluttered. I said nothing. I put the canned tomatoes in the cupboard. The red herrings, I would later understand, were both real and manufactured. Some created deliberately by Claire, others generated by my own increasingly unreliable interpretive mind. There was, for example, the matter of Tom. Mara's husband Tom called me in the second week of November, which was unusual. We were friendly but not close, and he'd never called me without Mara as the initiating context. He sounded slightly strained, slightly too casual, and he asked if Claire and I wanted to come to a dinner party they were hosting in December. I said we'd love to. Then, because the opening was right there and I could feel it, I asked how Mara was doing. Good, Tom said. Busy, you know. She and Claire have been doing Fridays pretty regularly, I said, keeping my voice entirely neutral. A pause. Very short. The kind that would be invisible in a normal conversation. Right? Tom said. Yeah, I think so. Not. Oh yes, Mara always comes home raving about it. Not. God. Those two. They close down every bar they go to. Just. Right? Yeah, I think so. The affirmation of someone confirming a thing they know nothing about. I hung up and sat in my car in the firm's parking garage for 11 minutes. I know it was 11 minutes because I watched the clock on the dashboard with the particular attention of a person who has just understood something and is not yet ready to act on it. Mara wasn't going to these Fridays. Or if she was, Tom didn't know about them. Either Mara was covering for Claire, lying to her own husband in support of whatever Claire was doing, or the Friday nights with Mara were a fiction entirely, a convenient name attached to evenings that had nothing to do with her. I drove home. I ate dinner. I helped Owen with his bath. I read Lily 3 chapters of her book. I kissed my wife goodnight and lay in the dark listening to her breathe. Steady, even, untroubled. The following Friday, I did something I'm not proud of. I told Claire I was going to stay at a work colleague's place after an evening industry event, a thing that happened occasionally when the event ran late and the drive home felt unreasonable. She accepted this without question, which I noted. I packed a small bag, kissed the kids, said goodbye, and drove away. Then I parked 2 blocks from our house and waited. At 7:41, Claire came out of the green door. She was wearing the camel coat. She walked to her car, got in, and drove. I followed at a distance I hoped was sufficient, 3 or 4 car lengths, never closer, always with at least one other car between us when possible. I felt, doing this, a particular kind of shame that I had no framework for. Not quite the shame of someone doing something wrong, but the shame of someone doing something that, once done, cannot be undone. A threshold crossed. She drove for 8 minutes. Then she pulled onto a street called Birchwood Crescent, 3 streets north of Ashwood Lane. I realized, my mental map of the neighborhood clicking into focus, and parked in front of a house with warm yellow light in the windows and a dark blue Toyota in the driveway. She got out of the car, walked to the front door, and knocked twice. The door opened. The light from inside framed her briefly. I was too far away to see who had opened it. She went inside. I sat in my car on the corner of Birchwood Crescent for 40 minutes, engine off, hands in my lap, watching the house with the yellow light. No one came out. No one else arrived. The blue Toyota sat in the driveway with perfect stillness. After 40 minutes, I drove away. I checked into a cheap hotel downtown, not because I needed to maintain the fiction of the work event, but because I couldn't make myself go home. I lay on the hotel bed in my clothes and stared at the popcorn ceiling and felt the precise geography of my life rearranging itself around a new and terrible center of gravity. I still didn't know whose house it was, but I knew that Frank Olson lived on Birchwood Crescent, and I remembered his face in the driveway, the careful smile, the unrunning hose. This section represents the transition from passive unease to active, if still reluctant, investigation. The psychological pivot point is Daniel's phone call with Tom, a moment where ambiguity collapses into near certainty. Tom's inadequate confirmation, right? Yeah, I think so, is the verbal equivalent of a structure failing a load test. It doesn't break. It just reveals that it cannot bear the weight placed on it. Daniel's decision to follow Claire is ethically complex and psychologically understandable. He experiences it as shameful, which indicates he is still operating within a moral framework. He knows this crosses a line. But the shame coexists with compulsion because the alternative is continuing to live inside an uncertainty that is quietly destroying him. This is a common response to suspected betrayal. The need to know becomes more urgent than the fear of what knowing will cost. The most important detail in this section is the geographical one. Birchwood Crescent, 3 streets from home. The proximity is psychologically devastating in a way that a distant hotel or another city would not be. It suggests not a world Claire escaped to, but a parallel life she constructed within the boundaries of their shared neighborhood, visible, almost, from their own front door. This is an intimacy of deception, a kind of audacity that implies long practice and deep familiarity. And Frank Olson's presence on that street recontextualizes everything. His garden hose vigils, his careful smiles, his too attentive watching of their house. He is no longer simply a kind neighbor. He is a witness. The question now is not what he knows, but what it will take for him to say it. I went back to work on Monday with the particular hollow efficiency of someone operating under controlled shock. I answered emails. I reviewed load calculations for a bridge support project. I ate a sandwich at my desk without tasting it. My colleague Pete stopped by my office to show me something on a tablet, and I nodded at intervals and retained nothing. What I was actually doing, beneath all of it, was thinking about Marcus. The name had weight now. It occupied space. I needed a last name, a face, a context, something to attach the name to so that it stopped floating in my mind like a word repeated until it loses meaning. I started carefully. I went through Claire's public social media, which she used infrequently and with the careful curation of someone who understood optics. Nothing obvious. The usual domestic images, the kids, a coffee cup, a sunset from our back deck. I searched through the photos for unfamiliar faces and found none that recurred in any suggestive pattern. Then I searched the address. Birchwood Crescent was a short residential street, 11 houses. I found the property records online, public information, the kind of thing you could access in 5 minutes if you knew where to look. And as an engineer who dealt with municipal records regularly, I knew exactly where to look. I cross-referenced the address with the dark blue Toyota in the driveway. The house belonged to a man named Marcus Hale. I sat with that for a long time. Marcus Hale, 39 years old, according to the LinkedIn profile I found 20 minutes later. Senior creative director at a mid-sized marketing firm downtown. The profile photo showed a lean man with dark hair, slightly long, and an easy, confident smile of the kind that reads as charismatic in photographs. He had mutual connections with Claire, 3 of them, all from the design and creative industry, which made sense given their overlapping professional worlds. He was divorced. No children listed. The profile hadn't been updated in 8 months. I stared at his photograph for longer than I should have and felt something cold and specific settle in my chest. Not rage, not yet, but something more like recognition. Like seeing a word you've been trying to remember finally written down in front of you. The following Tuesday, I drove to Birchwood Crescent at noon. I told myself I was just going to look at the house. Confirm it was real, confirm the Toyota, confirm that my mind hadn't constructed an elaborate fiction from fragments. I drove past slowly, blue Toyota, yellow light in the front window even at midday, a potted fern on the porch that needed watering. Ordinary house, ordinary street. I was about to drive on when I saw Frank Olson. He was walking his neighbor's dog, a big, elderly Labrador that moved with the cautious dignity of advanced age, and he was coming from the direction of Marcus Hale's house. When he saw my car, he stopped. Then he recognized me, and something happened in his face, a kind of settling, a decision being made, a door opening that had been closed a long time. He raised a hand, not his usual careful wave, something more deliberate. I pulled over. He approached the passenger window, and I lowered it. The Labrador pressed its gray muzzle against the door, and Frank looked at me with an expression I can only describe as the face of a man who has been waiting for permission. "Daniel," he said. "Frank." A moment of silence. The dog made a small sound. "I think you should come in for coffee," Frank said. We sat at his kitchen table, a solid old oak table, the kind that outlasts everything, and Frank poured coffee from a French press and set a plate of shortbread between us that he clearly hadn't made himself, store-bought in a tartan tin. He sat across from me with his hands wrapped around his mug and looked at the table for a moment before looking up. "How long have you known?" I asked. "Since April," he said. "April. 7 months." While I was reviewing load calculations and reading bedtime stories and eating casserole with sticky notes on it, Frank Olson had been sitting on 7 months of knowledge. He told me carefully, with the measured precision of a man who had clearly rehearsed this, or imagined it, or both. He had seen Claire's car on Birchwood Crescent the first time in early April, a Friday night, parked in front of Marcus Hale's house. He'd assumed it was nothing, a neighbor visiting a neighbor, but it continued. Every Friday, sometimes a Saturday. Sometimes her car was there when he walked the Labrador in the evening, and still there when he walked past at 11. He had thought about telling me many times, but he wasn't certain, he said. He didn't want to destroy a family on the basis of a parked car. He'd looked for other explanations. He told himself it was a book club, a design project, a neighborhood committee he wasn't aware of. But then, he said and paused. I saw them together. Through his front window. Last month. He didn't elaborate on what he'd seen. I didn't ask him to. "I didn't know how to tell you," he said. His voice was quiet and without excuse. "I'm sorry, Daniel. I kept thinking, it's not my place. But then I kept thinking, if it were me, if Diane had done this, I would have wanted to know." I looked at the shortbread on the plate, the tartan tin, the French press going cold between us. "Did she ever see you?" I asked. "Does she know you know?" Frank shook his head. "I walk early. 6:30. She's never out there at 6:30. I nodded slowly. I didn't cry. I didn't feel, in that moment, anything with clear edges. It was more like standing in a building after the load-bearing wall has been removed, still standing, technically, but aware that the structural logic of the thing has fundamentally changed. "There's something else," Frank said. I looked at him. "Her friend, the dark-haired woman, comes sometimes on the Fridays. I think her name is Mara. Mara comes to the house." Frank nodded carefully. "A few times. She'd arrive before Claire, sometimes. Leave before Claire." So Mara knew. Mara was not the alibi. Mara was the accomplice. The women's nights out had been a shared construction, maintained by 2 people who each had reasons to keep it standing. I drove home from Frank's house with both hands on the wheel and my mind completely quiet, the specific quiet of a place that has been emptied. Claire was at her desk when I arrived, working on a design project, her reading glasses pushed up on her forehead. She looked up and smiled. "You're early. Moved some things around," I said. She nodded and went back to her screen. I went upstairs, sat on the edge of the bed, and stared at the wall for a long time. Then I opened my phone and found Tom's number. I texted him, "Hey, does Mara have plans this Friday?" His reply came in 4 minutes. "No, she's home." What? I put the phone face down on the mattress. The last piece I needed was something concrete. Something Claire couldn't explain away with a client project or a friend's name. Something real and undeniable that I could hold in my hands when I finally said what needed to be said. I thought about that for 2 days before I understood what it was. Frank revelation scene is the story's emotional fulcrum, and its psychological texture is more complex than a simple disclosure. Frank is not merely an informant. He is a man shaped by his own loss, by the specific grief of having loved a faithful spouse and buried her, and that loss gives his knowledge of Daniel's situation a particular moral weight. His 7 months of silence were not cowardice, exactly, but a form of protective hesitation, the reluctance of a man who knows what families cost to build and what they cost to break. The detail that Mara was present at Marcus Hale's house, arriving before Claire, leaving before her, reframes the earlier red herring of the Friday nights with devastating efficiency. Mara was not simply providing cover. She was actively participating in the infrastructure of the deception. This reveals a social betrayal layered beneath the intimate one. Claire's marriage was undermined not only by her own choices, but by the complicity of someone Daniel had trusted and welcomed into his home. Daniel's response to all of this, the quiet, the hands on the wheel, the emptied mind, is psychologically consistent with what researchers describe as dissociative numbing, the nervous system's protective response to information too large to process immediately. He is not suppressing emotion. He is being temporarily protected from the full impact of it by a mental architecture designed for exactly this kind of load. His text to Tom is precise and controlled, a final verification, closing the last door of doubt. For minutes, and Tom's reply confirms everything. Daniel is now in possession of the complete truth. The question is no longer what happened. The question is what he does with it. I chose a Thursday, not a Friday. I didn't want to give her the exit of a scheduled night out, the ability to say we'll talk about this when I get back, and disappear into the house on Birchwood Crescent while I sat with the kids and the color-coded calendar. Thursday was contained. Thursday was ours. I arranged for the kids to stay at Claire's mother's house for the night. A sleepover they were both delighted by, Owen especially, because her mother had a cat. I told Claire it was a spontaneous gesture, a rare evening for the two of us. She seemed pleased. She texted her mother a heart emoji. I watched her do it. That evening, I made dinner. Pasta. The same one we'd been eating when Lily mentioned Marcus and the dog in the big yard. I don't know if I chose it consciously. I set the table properly, with the good plates, which we usually only used for guests. Claire came downstairs dressed casually and touched my arm as she passed me to fill her water glass, a small instinctive gesture of affection that made my jaw tighten. We sat down. We ate. She talked about a client project, a rebrand for a small architecture firm, she said, which had irony in it that she couldn't see. I asked questions. I listened. My hands were steady. I realized, calm in the way that people are calm when they've already made the decision and the decision has made everything else irrelevant. Halfway through the meal, I put my fork down. "How's Marcus?" I said. The pause lasted approximately 2 seconds. Claire's fork continued its path for a fraction of a moment before she set it down as well. She looked at me, and what I saw in her face was not guilt. Exactly. It was something more complicated. A rearranging. A person rapidly revising their available options. "What?" "Marcus Hale," I said. "Birchwood Crescent. The house with the blue Toyota. You've been going there every Friday for 7 months. Mara has been there too, sometimes. She's been covering for you." A silence that had texture to it. The refrigerator hummed. Claire's hands were flat on the table. "Daniel, I'm not asking if it's true," I said. "I know it's true. I'm asking you to stop insulting both of us by pretending there's another explanation." Her eyes moved. To the table, to the window, back to me. I watched her choose, visibly, between the remaining options. Denial, unsustainable given what I'd just listed. Minimization, possible, but I'd clearly done my research. Anger, deflection, a bluff. She rejected all three in approximately 4 seconds of visible internal calculation, and what settled on her face afterward was something I hadn't expected. Not shame, not defiance. Something that looked disturbing, like relief. "How long have you known?" "Long enough," Tell me when it started. She told me. Her voice was quiet and level. The particular steadiness of someone who has imagined this conversation so many times that they've exhausted most of the emotion in advance. March, she said. A professional event, a mutual colleague. It had been nothing at first. Conversations, then longer conversations, then a coffee that became lunch that became something she didn't name for a month, even to herself. Does he know you're married? I said. Yes. Does he know about the kids? Yes. Something about the straightforwardness of these answers was worse than evasion would have been. It meant there was no convenient fiction in which Marcus Hale was deceived, no version in which Claire was a woman in a lonely marriage being exploited by someone who didn't know the full picture. He knew. She knew he knew. It was a choice, made repeatedly, with full information. And Mara, I said. Something shifted. For the first time, Claire looked genuinely uncomfortable. She was trying to help me figure out what I wanted, Claire said. She wasn't. It wasn't her idea. She tried to talk me out of it, actually. At first. But then she helped you lie to me. She was protecting me. You needed protecting from me? The question landed somewhere real. Claire's jaw tightened. No, that's not. She stopped. Started again. I didn't know what I wanted, Daniel. I still don't. I know that's not what you need to hear right now, but it's honest. I looked at her. The good plates between us. The pasta going cold. What do you want? I said. She looked at me for a long time. I don't know. I stood up from the table. I cleared my plate to the kitchen, rinsed it with methodical thoroughness, and set it in the drying rack. I came back to the doorway. I want you to stay at your mother's tonight, I said. I'll tell her the kids are fine, that you'll be there for breakfast. She'll be happy. Daniel, I need to be in this house tonight without you in it. That's what I need right now. We can talk tomorrow. She went. She didn't argue, which told me something about her guilt and something about her own exhaustion with the situation she'd constructed. The green door closed behind her at 9:23. I sat in the kitchen for a long time, in the quiet house, with the good plates and the cold pasta and the color-coded calendar on the refrigerator. I did not call anyone. I did not look at my phone. I sat with what I knew and what I felt, and let both of them be exactly as large as they were. Sometime around midnight, I walked to the front window and stood looking out at Ashwood Lane. The street was dark and still. Across the road, Frank Olson's house was dark too, except for a single lamp in an upstairs window that glowed a warm amber through the curtains. He was awake. I wondered if he'd been waiting to see her leave. The confrontation scene subverts the genre's conventional expectations in a psychologically precise way. There is no screaming, no theatrical collapse, no dramatic unraveling. What Daniel stages is a controlled demolition, careful, deliberate, structurally sound. His choice of Thursday, the good plates, the same pasta from Lily's dinner, is not incidental. These are assertions of domestic reality, a conscious framing of the conversation within the life that is being threatened. He is not just confronting his wife. He is insisting on the weight and reality of what she has been treating as disposable. Claire's expression of relief, the most psychologically unsettling detail in the scene, reveals something important about the emotional economy of sustained deception. Maintaining a double life requires enormous ongoing effort. The managed stories, the closed bathroom doors, the rehearsed expressions. When the secret finally surfaces, a part of the deceiver experiences genuine release from that effort, regardless of the consequences. This is not callousness, it is human, but it is devastating to witness. Her admission that she doesn't know what she wants is, paradoxically, the most honest thing she has said in months. It reframes the affair not as a simple choice to leave Daniel for someone else, but as a symptom of an internal confusion she never surfaced, never addressed, never brought into the marriage where it might have been worked with. The tragedy is not only the deception but the silence that preceded it, the needs unspoken, the distance unacknowledged, the conversation that never happened until it was too late for it to help. Daniel's final action, asking her to leave, clearing his plate, standing at the window watching Frank's lamp, is the behavior of a man choosing dignity over dissolution. He is, in this moment, stronger than his situation. The weeks that followed had a quality I can only describe as surgical. Things were separated, categorized, addressed one by one with a precision that I think surprised both of us. Claire came back the next morning, as I'd asked. We sat at the kitchen table, not the good plates this time, just coffee, And we talked for 3 hours with the kids at her mother's and the house entirely quiet around us. We talked in the way that people talk when they've stopped performing for each other and there's nothing left to protect. She told me more. I listened. I asked questions when I needed to and didn't when I didn't. She had not, she told me, been in love with Marcus Hale. She didn't know if that made it better or worse. What she had been, she said, was lost. Lost in a way she hadn't known how to name or bring to me. A creeping sense of invisibility that had nothing to do with how I treated her and everything to do with something she'd stopped being able to locate in herself. She'd been looking for it in the wrong place. She knew that now. I didn't tell her that knowing it now was 7 months too late. I didn't need to. She knew. What do you want to happen? She asked me. I don't know yet, I said. And that was the first honest thing I'd said to her in weeks. We decided, carefully and without drama, to separate while we figured it out. Claire moved to her mother's, temporarily, practically, with as little disruption to the kids' routine as we could manage. I stayed in the house on Ashwood Lane. Lily took it with the careful seriousness of a 9-year-old who understood more than we wanted her to. Owen cried twice, and then was mostly concerned about which house the cat situation applied to, which made us both almost smile. Almost. I called Mara 3 weeks after the confrontation. She picked up on the second ring, which told me she'd been waiting for this call for some time. She apologized, at length and, I believe, sincerely. She told me what Claire had told me, that she'd tried to talk her out of it in the beginning, that she'd refused to go to the house for the first several months, that her eventual involvement had been a slow, reluctant concession to a friend she didn't know how to stop protecting. I listened to all of it. Does Tom know? I asked. A pause. I told him. Last week, when I realized you knew. How did that go? Not well, she said quietly. So, the chain of fractures extended further than I'd imagined. The lie that had protected Claire's secret had been its own structure, bearing its own weight. And when the foundation shifted, it shifted everything above it. Marcus Hale, I never contacted. I had no interest in him, not out of indifference, but because he existed in a separate register of the problem. He was a symptom, not a cause. Whatever Claire had been looking for in his house on Birchwood Crescent, it was something that had been missing long before he arrived. The structural failure in our marriage predated him. He was just where the crack became visible. I saw Frank in December, walking the Labrador. I'd learned by then that the dog was named Clifford, which made Owen laugh for approximately 45 seconds when I told him. Frank and I stood at the edge of his driveway in the cold, our breath making small clouds, and he asked me how I was doing with the directness of someone who actually wanted to know. Getting clearer, I said. He nodded. He seemed, somehow, lighter than he'd been when he was carrying the knowledge alone. She didn't deserve you, he said. I don't think it was about deserving, I said. And I meant it. I had spent a long time in those early weeks trying to construct a villain, assembling evidence of Claire's wrongness, her carelessness, her casual destruction. But the truth I kept arriving at was more complicated and less satisfying than villainy. She was a woman who had gotten lost and made terrible choices about how to find herself. That was devastating. It was also, in the end, more human than monstrous. The divorce was finalized the following spring. It was not vicious. We were both too tired for viciousness and too aware of Lily and Owen sitting in the middle of whatever we built between us. We built, with significant effort, something functional. Shared custody, clear boundaries, cordial if not warm communication. Claire started therapy in January. She told me so without my asking, which I took as a sign of something, though I wasn't sure what. I started therapy in February, which I should have done years earlier and will now recommend to anyone who asks. What I found, in those 50-minute weekly sessions, was less a discovery about Claire and more a discovery about myself. About the ways I had also grown quiet, also turned inward, also stopped asking the questions that needed asking. I was not responsible for her choices, but I had been, in my own way, absent from a marriage I thought I was fully present in. I had confused stability for intimacy and routine for connection. These are different things. It took me losing the marriage to understand the distinction. There were nights that first winter when I would sit in the house after the kids were asleep and feel the full weight of everything at once. The absence, the reconfigured future, the small specific grief of a life that had been good in so many ways and had still, somehow, not been enough. Those nights were real and they were hard, and I don't want to soften them. But there were also mornings, early, before anyone else was up, when I'd stand in the kitchen with the first coffee and the winter light coming gray and clean through the window, when I felt something I hadn't felt in years. A kind of cleanness, a sense of my own outline. I'm told this is what the other side of grief feels like. I'm inclined to believe it. Lily, in the spring, asked me if Mom and I would ever get back together. I thought about it seriously, the way she deserved, before I answered. No, sweetheart, I said. But we're both going to be okay. And you and Owen are going to be okay. That's the part that matters most. She considered this with her characteristic 9-year-old gravity. Is Frank going to be our neighbor forever? She asked. I don't know. I hope so. Me too, she said. He brings good tomatoes. I laughed, really laughed, the kind that comes from somewhere lower than performance, for the first time in months. Some losses teach you what you were taking for granted. Some betrayals, in their eventual clarity, become a strange kind of gift, not because they don't hurt, but because they force a reckoning that comfort would have indefinitely delayed. I am 39 years old now. I live on Ashwood Lane, in the house with the green door. My children are here half the week, and the other half I learn what it means to be alone in a way I've never been before. I am rebuilding something. Not the marriage, not the life I had, but something that belongs more entirely to me. I don't know yet what it will look like when it's finished. But for the first time in a long time, I trust my own perception of the walls. The resolution section resists the twin temptations of the genre. It neither punishes Claire into a villain nor redeems the marriage into a second-chance narrative. What Daniel achieves instead is something rarer and psychologically more honest, the capacity to hold complexity without requiring it to resolve into simplicity. Claire was wrong, repeatedly and consequentially. She was also, by her own admission, lost. Both of these things are true simultaneously, and Daniel's ability to accommodate both is the measure of his growth. The chain reaction of fractures, Claire's secret destabilizing Mara's marriage, Mara's confession to Tom, the structural collapse extending outward, illustrates a theme that runs beneath the entire story. Deception is never contained. Secrets require maintenance, and maintenance requires accomplices, and accomplices have their own relationships, their own vulnerabilities, their own walls that can't indefinitely bear borrowed weight. The therapy revelation is not incidental. Daniel's acknowledgement that he had confused stability for intimacy and routine for connection is the story's deepest self-examination. Betrayal, in its most instructive form, does not only reveal what was done to us, it reveals the conditions under which it became possible. Daniel was not absent in the way of a neglectful husband, but in the subtler way of someone who stopped asking the questions that keep a marriage alive. This is not guilt, it is awareness. And awareness is where genuine change begins. The final image, trusting his own perception of the walls, is precisely calibrated. For a structural engineer, walls are not metaphor. They are his professional reality. To trust them again is to reclaim both his vocational identity and his interior one. The story ends not with resolution in the conventional sense, but with the beginning of it. A man standing inside his own life, clear-eyed, intact, and finally building something that will hold. This story operates on the principle that the most devastating betrayals are not the dramatic ones, not the sudden revelations or explosive confrontations, but the slow, ambient erosions of intimacy that precede them. The affair was not the beginning of Daniel and Claire's trouble. It was the visible symptom of a quiet crisis neither of them had named. Claire's emotional disappearance predated Marcus Hale. Daniel's comfortable blindness predated his suspicion. The marriage had been failing in ways both parties found easier to maintain than to address. And in this, the story transcends the individual case and touches something universal about long-term partnership. The psychological architecture of the narrative traces a precise path, from unconscious comfort to ambient unease, from unease to reluctant investigation, from investigation to devastating knowledge, from knowledge to confrontation, from confrontation to the slow, unglamorous work of reconstruction. Each stage required Daniel to surrender a version of reality he preferred, and each surrender cost him something real. This is the emotional truth of betrayal, not a single moment of loss, but a sequential letting go of every comfortable assumption that preceded it. Frank Olson functions in the story as more than a plot mechanism. He is a figure of what long love, faithfully lived produces in a person not innocence or naivety, but a precise understanding of what fidelity costs and what its absence destroys. His 7 months of silence were not complicity, but a kind of grief. The grief of a man who knows what is being lost and can't find the right moment to prevent it. His eventual disclosure, offered without drama and at personal cost, is the story's moral center. What the story ultimately argues is that trust is not merely an emotion but a structural condition, something built, maintained, tested, and repaired. When it fails, the failure is rarely one person's alone. The rebuilding, however, must begin somewhere. And it begins, always, with honesty about the walls.